Hello and welcome to the third in our series, looking at the crisis of architectural theory, or at least the perceived crisis in architectural theory. Crisis, what crisis? Today, it's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce two luminaries in the field. Firstly, Albena Yaneva, who is our Digital Futures 2025 Mark Cousins Theory Award holder. She's not an architect by training, but she's had an incredible impact on the world of architecture and has been prolific in the books that she's produced. Albena was actually did her PhD under Bruno Latour, the famous French sociologist, and among her many books is a guide to Latour for architects. Albena is currently, she was at the University of Manchester. She's now teaching at the Politecnico di Torino and also as a professor and as an adjunct at Columbia University in New York. Andrew Ballantyne is a long-standing friend of mine. Andrew used to come and teach Deleuze at the University of Nottingham when I was running the program on architecture and critical theory. Andrew has quite a kind of eclectic range of topics. His PhD was on Richard Payne Knight on landscape architecture, and he then veered into the area of contemporary theory. Wrote a book. A series of books. Most famously, I think, his book Architecture, a very short introduction that has been translated into 23 different languages. And that, I've got to say, is a remarkable number. I once had 10 for one of my books, but 23, don't even know what languages those would be. So it's great to have you two here. Andrew, of course, is now, I just mentioned he was at the University of Newcastle, now retired, and on an extended field trip to France where he's studying medieval architecture and enjoying being in France. It's great to have you two here. I would like to invite Albena to share. Well, you're already sharing the screen to kick things off. Albena, welcome. It's great to have you back here.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you for organizing this series of discussions, which are very timely, I think. So crisis, what crisis? I have been thinking how to respond to this challenge, and the first two debates have been quite interesting in unpacking the crisis. I believe we have, in a way, reached that moment of critique that we no longer have the luxury, in a way, to simply reflect on architecture from a distance or reflect on architecture by simply bringing concepts from other fields, be this philosophy, arts, the sciences, and apply them to architecture, embracing this kind of fatigue idea of the intellectual as a custodian of eternal value. Blocking any movement, any development is not an option any longer in the field. And perhaps that's one of the reasons we have been experiencing this crisis. The contemporary complexity of practice, the scale and speed of architecture requires us to find new ways of engaging with architectural objects and processes, new ways of apprehending the dynamic waves of practice, of design development, of city developments, with their creative trends, technological infra developments, cultural twists, and to get to understand intra-canonical movements of practice and the quick developments that we witness. But how can we do this? From a panoramic perspective or from the ground, by slowing down or speeding up? by following key protagonists or by being interested in everyone? The humans or more than humans? The speeds of formation of entities or the entities that are already shaped? Are our methods of critique agile enough to capture all these movements and all these developments to resist to these winds and waves of practice and to create new ones? And if so, what are the investigatory and writing tactics that will allow us as critics to seize the speeds and movements of contemporary architecture, to understand contemporary architectural developments? In this short position paper, I will address these questions, and I will also discuss a new form of earthly architectural critique, one that does not assume that truth or knowledge about design and the urban is something that is out there, ready to be discovered, but knowledge has to be created, it has to be followed, traced, and understood through new methods of inquiry. I will also formulate some methodological suggestions. First, we need to stay on the ground. We need to abandon all sorts of panoramic and panoptic views and ways of looking at buildings and cities from a distance. Forget about the Eiffel Tower and the viewing platform. We believe that Paris can be seen from up there, but it cannot. Forget about the office of Rem Koolhaas. You believe that OMA's design can be understood from up there, but it can't. We rarely witness a building or a city as a whole, as an objective reality that presents itself in front of us. And that is why, as critics of architecture, we need to abandon all sides where we talk about these activities as a whole and from an abstract perspective. We could instead focus on the small sides of practice, on this kind of misty locales of urban and design practice, where very little can be seen, but it can be seen well. Those sites, termed by Bruno Latour oligopticums, in opposition to panopticum, are fundamentally invisible. Examples of oligopticum include, for instance, an architectural studio, a model-making shop, an urban lab, a conservation lab in an archive, in an architecture archive, or in the curatorial kind of meetings in big architectural exhibitions like the Biennale or other big forums. Once we are in those spaces, we find ourselves in offices, in corridors. We trace alignments, instruments, dossiers, codes, and solvents. We can witness teamwork, alerts, or dangers. So all these rare and fragile places are situated on the ground, not on the top, under our feet, not in our imagination. So to capture, for instance, design as a process or urban dwelling or in habitation, we need to move and meander through those sites of practice. It is a pragmatic absurdity indeed to believe that a building or a city can be seen as a totality, as an objective frame, but they are to be traced, composed, and understood. Staying on the ground, we can observe and we can follow trajectories of traces, series of transformations, small and big, perceptible and distinct, running a different pace of speed in front of us, with us. This leads us to generate realistic accounts of practice. And this is one possible way for us to join the waves of practice, to join current developments and discussions that are of concern to practitioners and urban dwellers, and to provide a better understanding of what happens in relationships, in relation to those waves of practice. Let us take one particular oligopticon as an example, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, which was the very first site that I have explored as an anthropologist and sociologist trained in ethnographic methods. So in an oligopticon like this, like OMA, one can capture the contingency of design and the contingency as a design process as key for understanding how buildings, cities, and environments come into being. So to grasp the meaning of OMA buildings and Koolhaas's architecture, we need to forget all about the star architect, and we need to forget all about what's in the imagination of the creator, what were his ideas, and we need to forget about the buildings, the final outcomes of architectural production, and turn away from official interpretations in architectural history and theory. This means to circumvent traditional understandings of star authorship in the spirit of subjectivist interpretations, and also critical historical interpretations of architecture. Instead, we could follow the architect in the practice and the many different collaborators in an architectural practice. We could follow the models, the foam, the materials, the software, and the tools mobilized by architects to design. But we can also unfold the different networks of collaborators and participants, like engineers, clients, professional model makers, interior designers, that all contribute and co-author very often architectural concepts. This would also mean accounting ethnographically for the ordinary forces and conditions of design experience, following not the star architect, but many young designers in the office and the paths their work have traced. We can track the way their actions spread and the way architects make sense of their world-building activities. The routines, the mistakes, and the workaday choices usually considered of lesser importance for the understanding of architecture. In so doing, we can arrive at a better understanding of OMA's design by the means of a detour to design experience. The purpose is to avoid the passage through the vague notions of culture, society, imagination, origins, values, which do not explain anything, but very often need explanation, as social scientists have argued. Thus, from the incidental accounts of design as product, we can shift attention to design as practice, from buildings as static objects to buildings as uncertain and contested moving targets. This requires tracing slowly and ethnographically, with ethnographic techniques, the complex socio-spatial coordinates of design as a process through the daily work of people and things involved in architectural production. Other oligopticons that we can trace in a similar way include, for instance, archival institutions and archival collections, and architectural mega projects like the Architecture Biennale. And we can, of course, continue the list. Educational institutions involved in architectural pedagogy, and we can continue the list. So in all these settings, we can witness how architecture unfolds and how architecture is not static. Staying on the ground help us to inquire into the current conditions of life in a world we inhabit, and to also recognize all participants in this world. Not to focus just on the final product, typically a static object that we attempted to explain with concepts coming from the field of society or culture. So this is the left-hand side of the diagram, but a careful and slow inquiry into the networks of practice will help us to include other actors and participants in the production and consumption of architecture, the young designers, the foam cutter in the practice, not just the star architect that is commonly visible. If we talk about archival institutions, we'll pay attention to the work of curators, archivists, and technicians, solvents, and sometimes the oxidants, different substances that are there and that are important for the restoration of architectural objects, rather than just the star architect and the star curators. And we can continue the list. So this realistic earthly approach could enable us to account for all sorts of practical work that contribute to the making of knowledge in architecture. In all these cases, we can join an ongoing process of exploring, testing, repairing, and reappraising the architectural connections of design objects to the world. We join, we might say, the waves of practice. We unpack the networks of design or urban dwelling, and we join those waves and current developments. To fully understand them, we need to follow design or urban dwelling very slowly. We should not rush to explain right away, and to replace them with quick concepts coming from the field of society, culture, or sometimes from the field of philosophy, a concept that is very appealing or relevant, but generated in a different field, might be brought into architectural discussions to explore phenomena that we see on the ground. We should not be rushing to make those connections, to explain, but we should follow slowly. Exploring a building through repetitive visits on a construction site, for instance, or in the design practice, we can experience various speeds and intensities of the processes unfolding there, rather than just contemplating the final object as an aesthetic or technologically performing object. We could follow the making and the construction of this architectural object and try to experience the various speeds and intensity of these processes unfolding there, the changing crowds of people and the flow of things. We can observe, document, interview, and trace different activities, movements, and gestures. Once in the design office, for instance, just follow for a second the moves of the foam as Shiro, one of the young architects at OMA, is using the foam cutter, and as he's trying to reach to that new shape of a building to be. Follow his gestures very slowly. Once in an archive, this is the CCA, the Conservation Lab, follow just for a moment the tentative gestures of the conservator, Karen, performing a treatment of a molded drawing, placing it in a folder, adding a code on its way of becoming archival. So we literally trace the becoming archival of this object. Follow all those operations slowly, and through their presence and immediacy, you can grasp the specificity of various architectural objects and architectural institutions. You can gradually gain experience about architectural objects and processes in their own qualities and relations. It is this rich experience that will form the core of our interpretations. This is, I'll argue, the only foundation for theory, for architectural theory, and for meaningful architectural critique. If the observation is based on experience, and if on the basis of this experience, we come up with a concept, with a new concept that is born from this specific experience. Staying on the ground, following slowly, we can also give speech to that which has no language. The foam, the cutter, the spatula, the dust, the mold, all these non-humans are part of the story because they pass action. It is through the sliding of action from designer to model, if we go back to Shiro on the left-hand side, it is through the sliding of action from the foam model to the designer, back to the designer, to the drawing, to the potential spaces and objects involved in this interaction that designing happens. There's neither simply a subject, Shiro, a young architect, or an object, the model, an architect and the model, an archivist or a molded drawing that we see on the other picture. Instead, what enacts the chain of action is the foam cutter that makes the architect bend and interact with the nebulous texture of versatile foam. Or, moving to the archival case, it's the fishy smell of a molded drawing making the spatula of the conservator perform a treatment of the drawing. So it's this constant choreography of action between humans and non-human subjects and objects that is performed before our eyes. Following these non-humans moving back and forth between sides, allow us to witness how a design object or an archive become knowable, traceable, and how they work. Moreover, new narrative techniques are needed to capture this dense contextuality of designing and the rhythms and speeds that we can trace while we are on the ground. These narrative techniques could help us to capture the unique, to trace and measure the pluriverse of life without replacing the specific with the general, and without unveiling in a kind of critical fashion what is behind architectural objects and processes. Being situated within the heart of urban life to capture its specificity can inspire us to invent a new syntax for architectural critique, a foreign language within the language, we might say. Writing will therefore require us to embrace a liquid or a gaseous rhetoric, capturing states of affairs or of practice that do not have fixed shape or size. This new syntax of critique can defy normal perceptions and conventional opinions that are commonly solid and geometric, certain, formal, and immutable. This would mean becoming all the more earthly, and here I quote Deleuze, by inventing laws of liquids and gases on which the earth depends, end of quote. In the spirit of this new syntax of architectural critique, writing will not mean putting words and phrases together, bringing concepts from another field into another field and putting it together with architectural objects, so bringing solids, as Deleuze might say, using ideas and concepts explaining, but would rather imply opening up the words and questioning their meaning. So whilst we are in the network of practice and we unpack urban dwelling or design, we question the meaning of the words that we hear from our actors, from the actors we interview and the entities we trace. So writing will become all about opening the meaning of these words, trying to question their inner meaning, breaking things open, rather than an imaginative process in our heads. Writing will lead us to produce existence, real characters and bodies, not static and mute, but alive, uncertain, informal, moving as we speak. Thus, abandoning all solid states, all abstractions, all big panorama, all grand attempts of pointing out to the timeless nature of architectural works, to enduring values, to origins or external factors upon the creation, architectural critique will rely on careful tracing and gaseous syntax to generate critique from within. Instead of unraveling the origin of a creative effort by asking questions that refer to essence, causality, or explanation, questions like what is it, what is this, what caused this development, architectural urban development, what factors led to this form of architecture. Just to give a few examples, this new form of earthly critique should set questions of radically different nature. Questions such as how does this building work? How does it engage? What is it that puts it in motion? In what cases? How and where? Where and how? What are its modalities of action? How does architectural knowledge become traceable? How does an architectural object become knowable? Under what circumstances can it be seen, grasped, and composed? The how and where questions will contribute to putting things into new orbits, to activating these waves of practice gradually and slowly, with excitement and bewilderment. It is these questions that will get us taken up in the motion of a big wave or a column of a rising air. Critique will thus contribute to movement, to many movements, to many new waves. Architectural critique will continue to rely on new ways of interferences and will continue to rely on mutual resonance and exchange with other fields. Philosophy, art, science, they all have their separate melodic lines and parallel movements in constant interplay with one another. Yet the transfer of concepts will from one field to another will not lead us to a new direction in our field. We rather need to make moves on our own by slowing down, tracing, turning around, giving away or taking, capturing this internal dynamics of formation of the networks of practice, or the different aggregates. And we can continue to explore resonances and interferences with other fields without directly borrowing concepts, which I think is something that has paralyzed architectural discourse, and which this series of debates are trying to unpack, I believe, in a successful way. Finally, mediators are also fundamental for the production of a new type of critique. Just as design invention is all about mediators, so is the art of architectural critique. Without them, nothing happens. They can be people, but also academic institutions, intellectual mentors, professional societies, new technologies, the novels we write and we read and that inspire us, the artists that challenges our thinking, the publishers, journals, students, and platforms like Digital Future Platform, the Digital Future Platform that inspires debates. These are all mediators that facilitate a certain type of critique. As Deleuze argued, I need my mediators to express myself, and they never express themselves without me. Just as artistic and design creativity has nothing to do with that special talent of an individual genius, as argued by many art historians, from Michael Baxendale to Svetlana Alpers and Howard Beckett, a mundane product of the art and artistic products are mundane products of networks of collaboration and mediators, rather the reflection of an artistic genius. And so is architectural critique. The new earthly style of critique will also rely on new types of visualizations of the networks of practice, of the tracings, and new ways of situating them into larger comprehensive networks that could enhance their understanding. Finally, our critique could also make difference. But how? How can we make difference? Accounting the variable settings of design, as symbolic, contingent, and heterogeneous they might be, we as critics, we can situate ourselves within the belly of the monster, as Donna Haraway terms this. The more we immerse ourselves into these worlds of design and urban dwelling, the more we understand them. And the more we learn from those complex worlds that we try to trace and unpack, the more specific our accounts and interpretations get, the more our ability to intrude in design worlds will increase. At a certain point, the accounts that we can produce will start interfering into our object of study in one or another way, and according to the angle we take or the actors we follow. These accounts can become performative. And that is how we can intervene and we can make a difference. A new task for architectural critique can be put on the fore. Only by following the connections between architectural works and the conditions of their making and use, tracing particular ways of acting, moves and groupings, following the winds and the waves of practice, we will be able to contribute to a better understanding of architecture. This new earthly style of critique will contribute to situating the relevance and the limits of knowledge practices related to design without engaging in critique with capital C, but rather in what we call, following Deleuze, immanent critique, critique that is situated within the field of practice and derives from close engagement with practice. So this new style of critique is inherently political and will inspire us to instigate change without the need to engage in big revolutionary moves, change that could come from within the field of practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Albena. That's a lot of food for thought there, and lots of interesting questions I think will arise from that. Let's move on straight to Andrew, and then we can have our series of questions afterwards. Andrew, welcome. Would you like to share your screen? You're muted. Andrew, you're muted. Not sure if we can
unmute. There we go.
Okay, there we go.
And
Good.
then share screen. Allow. No, that's sharing the wrong thing. I don't want to share that window. I want to share this window. But now I'm not on the page that invites me to share. Allow to share screen. And then I go to this one. No. Okay.
I don't know whether you can. Well, okay, you've. So the question is, first of all, clicking on share screen, and then it's a question of finding the particular window, as it were.
Right. So it's when I say share screen, it invites me to share
Multiple.
the screen of the meeting that we're looking at. Allow to share window, allow to share screen, don't allow.
Hold on. Yes. So you're on Zoom, right? And then you on Zoom you can see the share icon. Click on that, and that should then open up a host of other of windows, of which you have to click on the one that you want.
No, it's not doing that. Share. Right, where it says share screen, if I click on that, it gives me three choices. I can share a window.
Yes, try sharing a window.
Yeah. And then share this window. No, because that's the one we're looking at.
You want your PowerPoint window.
I do, yes. Where's that?
Is it open?
It is open, yes, but let's. There we go. I think I've got
great.
it.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Fantastic. So just make a full screen.
There we go.
Great.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it. Great.
Right. So this is a very different kind of presentation, which I imagined more as a preamble to a discussion. So it's well, I'll just do what I've set up, and we'll take it from there. But it will be relatively short. The place I wanted to begin was thinking about the idea of a crisis, and really thinking that architectural theory should be at the point of crisis. If it's worth doing, that's where you are. And I particularly like this evocation of where architecture is from Gottfried Semper, from his book Style in the Tectonic Arts. And it's the beginning of his preamble, the Prolegomena, where he says, "The nocturnal sky shows glimmering nebulae among the splendid miracle of stars, either old extinct systems scattered throughout the universe, cosmic dust taking shape around a nucleus, or a condition in between destruction and regeneration. They are a suitable analogy for similar events on the horizon of art history. They signify a world of art passing into the formless, while suggesting at the same time a new formation in the making." And if we go on, that idea concludes with this passage. "As long as whoever embraces it guards against the presumption of seeing himself as the founder and savior of a future art, he'll view his work more modestly as something in the process of becoming, or rather as the becoming of art in general, and set for himself the following task: to explore within individual cases the regularity and order that become apparent in artistic phenomena during the creative process of becoming, and to deduce from that the general principles, the fundamentals of an empirical theory of art." So that cosmic vision of space dust forming, decaying, looking for the symptoms of a new thing emerging from the particles of destruction, of processes of becoming in the universe, that image applied onto the art world is Semper's starting point, the vision, and it's one we can relate to very readily. And the surprising thing about it, I think, is that it was written in 1860, so 160 years ago. And his point is that then, and I think it's pretty much always the case in between, we're at a point of crisis, a point of decision, where things will change. And one way, well, a preoccupation of that state is wondering about the future, which is where we get Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, the angel of history, as Walter Benjamin imagined it. Walter Benjamin owned this drawing and had this to say about it. Says a storm is blowing from paradise and has got caught in this angel's wings. The storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows toward the sky. What we call progress is this storm. So that's written in 1940. But he's this image of the angel of history being blown backwards into the future It's this image of the state we're in relation to the future, where we're always sliding backwards into the future, not knowing what's going to be there, that the future is literally unknowable. It hasn't happened yet, but we can make some suppositions about it, and those suppositions are what we might call theory. And the most commonsensical version of theory, which might deny that it's theory at all, is the assumption that the future will be very much like the past. And there are times, there have been times, when that works very well, when you can continue doing the same thing, and it's okay. You think things work. There are other times when that kind of thinking is absolutely catastrophic, and the points of change. And as things are manifestly in a state of flux now, and arguably always have been, but the rate of change perhaps is increasing. It becomes untenable to assume that the future will be just like the past, and we must make some guesses as to what the future is going to be like. The future is always virtual, to use Deleuze's term. It's virtual when it's not conceptualized. But theory can be a repertoire of concepts that can help us to deal with the wreckage that the future sends our way. And in principle, the more concepts you have, the more kinds of situations, the more flexibility you have, the more you can, the more nuanced the ways in which you can react to what the future sends our way. And by the time the virtual has been conceptualized, it has become possible. It's a set of possibilities rather than the incoherent virtuality that we can't put a name to. So theory is a way of exploring possibilities, or more than one way of exploring many possibilities. And theory, in a very literal way, makes the future possible. Neil began introducing me as someone who'd started by studying Richard Payne Knight, and the thing that drew me to his work was his theoretical position that there were no principles that could be seen to be permanent, that could guide taste in a permanent sort of way. He set that out in 1805, and that seemed to me to be so obviously correct that I wondered why people didn't leave theory there. You just say anything can happen and leave it at that. But the problem with that position is that it's not useful, and you find that architects, designers, artists will cling to any principle going, no matter how absurd, that helps limit the range of decisions that they have to take in order to make negotiation with the future a practical possibility. And having limits on your decisions is a practical necessity, really, but certainly something that speeds things up, even though a lot of what happens could be manifestly wrong in the relatively short term. So my main point is that we shouldn't be worried about the idea of a crisis in architectural theory. I'd say that crisis should be embedded in what architectural theory is. Any theory that's worth doing is in crisis. That's where I finish.
Great. I was thinking of, and I forget the name of the book now, but the crisis of the Italian Renaissance, I think it was the title of the book, which is basically saying that, the whole of the Italian Renaissance came out of a crisis. Yes, I agree with you there. So we have the opportunity to have some questions, both here on the Zoom with the Zoom audience, and also on YouTube. If anyone's watching YouTube, those watching on YouTube can put your questions into the chat. And I don't want to take up too much space, but let me just kick off some things. Uh, Maybe I could maybe start with Albena's contribution, which I think is always very refreshing because it's from someone whose background is not in architecture and therefore somehow stepping out of that kind of all the kind of the fantasy, shall we say, of what it is to be an architect. So one thing, Albena, one of the interesting studios at the Architectural Association in the past, and one that was highly controversial, but I think must have been extraordinarily useful, was one studio where basically the entire year, what happened was that the members of the those students in the studio uh, infiltrated the different disciplines that were going on, the different actors, shall we say, in the in the design of a building. So they got into the engineer's office, they got into the mechanical engineer's office, the quantity surveyors, and so on, and some of them worked on site, which I thought was an extraordinary thing. And myself, having before I went to up to Cambridge, I worked on a building site, which was quite an extraordinary experience, and I think conditioned me in a quite useful way for stepping into the profession. So I could imagine in some senses that you presented one let's say trajectory through the architectural office. I could imagine there could be a multiplicity of different trajectories looking at that building a bit in the spirit of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, where in the end you discover it's just one city, even though they seem to be all completely different cities. And and I guess what came up yesterday in our discussion, we had another session yesterday, was the question of the fantasy of the architect, if you see it in Lacanian terms, as the lens through which architects look at the world. And we have a very, I would say, inflated view about our role. I think that there is a kind of myth behind it. So you get these different perspectives based on essentially different fantasies and so on. Um, so I've got two parts to this question. One is that, to how would you understand these other perspectives, shall we say? And the second question was is in a sense left out of your account, but it could well be just as interesting, is what happens after the building is built. We had the very first session in this series was a lecture by Slavoj Žižek, where he spoke about, the title was Architecture as Built Ideology. And he focused just on the building of, the construction of the building, and didn't go beyond that. And it seems to me that the building has a life well beyond what it's out of the hands of the architect, and especially in the context of something like the Architectural Association, which is an example I always give, which is which is was a building, was a house in a square, and has now become a school of architecture through the kind of rituals and practices that are going on there. And one of my publishers, I think you also publish in Bloomsbury, is also in the same square. The kind of from the outside, the only difference is one got a red door, one's got a black door, but what the rituals that are going on there are quite different. Anyway, that's a kind of two-part question, but just to kind of throw those ideas at you and to see what you think about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's of course extremely important to consider in the design process, the different fantasies or the different kind of ambitions of an architect that very often do not connect strictly to the design object, as you were also saying, but they are ambitions of a different nature. As they are a statement that very often position the architectural object in terms of social, cultural ambitions, ecological aspirations, especially in the current climate. A particular example that comes in mind, for instance, the Seattle Public Library, again, to take an example from the same office, it was not that much the kind of the ambition to respond to the brief and get to the final shape and this iconic building that will be celebrated, but through the design to make a statement about what reading will mean in the future, what kind of library, what even a library, what kind of building will be the library in the future in terms of cultural ambitions, in terms of the kind of positioning in society that the library will have. Of course, in order to make this statement, architects need to browse knowledge from many different fields. Yeah, the development of reading culture across different societies, the technology of reading, how reading is gradually replaced by many other different technologies, and you know this better than me. With AI, rapid AI developments, we are kind of reading as a practice becomes obsolete. So all these kind of investigations, including the investigation of the impact on the building, the very specific impact in the neighborhood and the communities where the building will be built. So it's impossible to have an ambition about the future of this building and to fantasize without browsing carefully knowledge and mobilizing knowledge from many different fields and crafting a design concept that will be relevant for the future in terms of social, cultural, ecological ambitions. And following how designers do this, how designers mobilize those knowledge, and how design is the ultimate transdisciplinary kind of field, is something amazing and something that theorists like us have the privilege to study. And to your second point about the life of the buildings once they're built, of course, that's another very important question. The social biography of buildings, what happens after they're built, how, and there's more and more discussions in the field at the moment with the focus on use and maintenance, on the aging of building, kind of reviving this old debate from Stuart Brand, how buildings learn, but in the new perspective, in the light of ecological debates, what it means to reuse, recycle, upcycle, all these kind of debates are at the moment quite relevant to the field. And I think the social and ecological biographies of the built and how we can continue to trace those lives of buildings after they're built are extremely relevant from a theoretical perspective also to follow.
I mean, just to pick up on that, on that kind of the first question in some sense, one of the slides you show, which I thought was very revealing, was this cartoon with Rem Koolhaas and kind of expressing frustration at the kind of the construction workers hadn't understood his vision. I guess as you know, as a kind of fly on the wall, you know, watching this process, you have a very, and not coming from an architectural background, which I think is a great advantage in many ways. You can see things in some ways in greater perspective to kind of see the ego of the architect, you know, and observe it. We always get frustrated. Well, I mean, whether or not everyone else shares our view of the architect of the vision of the building, we always get frustrated when we see articles about architecture or about buildings that don't even mention the architect. They don't even mention the architect as though the architect is really not that important, you know. And for us, you know, I think there is this kind of fantasy of what it is to be an architect, which is which is maybe at odds with what the general public think about the architect. So I just wondering especially with the context of Rem Koolhaas, who is someone with known for his kind of ego in some senses. What are your perceptions about this particular tribe, shall we call them, as a tribe of architects, and the way that this group works?
Right. Yeah, that's a very big question. So, although I do not come from the field of architecture, I consider myself, very much trained by the field and by many different observations. But my very first crash course in architecture was at OMA for 2 entire years, and then in many other practices like Moshe Sav, the architect, Sarah Polo, and many others through the years. So I have been exposed to different ways of doing architecture and different tribes, as you mentioned. So this kind of collective aspect, the cooperative activities of making architecture, the collective and distributed actions in design can be witnessed while you are there, while you are in the practice. So when we take a distance, obviously we see the figure of the star architect or the figure of the star curator. Now I'm completing a study on the architectural biennale where we see the same paradox when we are close and when we follow the work of a studio. We see how complex, distributed, and networked the work of architects is, to the extent that it's impossible to point one particular figure or one particular entity. And yet, for branding purposes, for kind of easy communication with journalists and clients, there's this one single figure that remains visible on the top of the studio. And perhaps for similar reasons, with architectural exhibitions, with the Biennale, we have this kind of figure of the chief curator doing this massive event, which is something that is reproduced in the legal documentation of the Biennale as a very traditional top-down hierarchical institution, and then reproducing the daily activities of the curatorial team, very much like in the architectural studio. So we have like a very similar model of a distributed network activity, a mission that is impossible to accomplish by one single creator, by the master, by the curator or the chief architect, and yet we continue to reproduce this myth for simplicity, because of traditions, because of many other reasons. So this kind of paradox is there. So how each studio brands itself and deals with this tension is a different question. It's translated in different ways, from the name of the studio, whether it's OMA or it's David Chipperfield and Partners, whether it's the name of a star and others, this star architect and others, or it's a new way of branding like OMA or Elementa. We can continue the list. So from the branding of the office through the kind of translations of these tensions at the level of hierarchy and practice until the very final kind of creative products that we see, this tension is translated in different ways. So this is something that is fascinating to see, and we continue to reproduce these tensions. I wouldn't say that in OMA, for instance, it's a different model than in other architectural practices, but it's important for us to capture and analyze those tensions at the level of practice.
I would say that quite possibly the whole culture of the biennial is another world in some senses. And I was really struck by the previous one to the last one, so the one that was about on Africa, where there was a kind of fantasy being played out about a concern about African culture and so on, and celebration of that. But then there was something else happening also at the same time as the biennial, which was Biennale, which was going on elsewhere in the Fora Biennale, where there was the Line project, which was being celebrated. There wasn't much architecture in the Africa section, but this is where all the architects were. And it struck me as kind of like, in a way, revealing that kind of fantasy when it comes to architects want to think of themselves as being concerned about, whatever. But the reality was, frankly, with the client, and where you kind of ignore maybe some aspects of the client's background and just accept it as a job, so you almost go into it blinkered in some senses. And I think Tom Main made that comment. I'm just the architect, I don't need to. Not for me to question the client. But it did seem to me to expose that fracture of the fantasy of what we are as a kind of caring group, or we like to think of as a caring group, versus the reality of being forced by life itself to accept the commissions from whomever. I don't know if
I've got some.
Yeah.
I just want to butt in to really to pick up a point that you were making earlier, but it connects with this one as well. But the idea of reusing buildings means that we, when we're designing, we should be giving more priority to the coherence of structure, so that that's the thing that lasts. Function is relatively ephemeral. Even if we're living in a house that's 100 years old, we're not living in it in the way that it was lived in when it was built. If you look at Le Corbusier's houses, even, pay attention to the servants' quarters in them. They were lived in quite a different way from what the kind of people who live in them now would put in place. So we need to pay more attention to the aspects of the buildings that will survive and that might last 1,000 years. The structure could well survive for a long time if it's coherent and robust, and it can be rearranged to do different sorts of things. But against that, there's the point that you were just making, which is that the function is likely to be what's the top priority for the client. And so the building has to be paid for by someone who does have function as the focus of the intent, but as a responsible architect with a long-term vision and the circular economy and all that, there's a need to have other priorities that come to bear on the program.
Yeah, I just think, well, maybe even the structure itself, unless there is a case where it's been as a preservation order, in which case you can't change anything. But the structure itself is also potentially at the mercy of the client. There's a comment that Foucault makes: the architect has got no control over me. I can change the building. But and of course, there's the Howard Rourke position, where we get very indignant if anybody changes anything. So let me just see whether there are any questions in the chat. I can. Andre, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see our two guests.
Hi.
Hello. So good to see you. I have a little. It's a question and a comment. When I was listening to both of you, I thought, my God, this is incredible. To what an extent these two talks are complementary. And let me tell you how I see it. It seems to me, and what it brought to mind is the title that Spybrook appropriates for his work, namely, he turns it around from the original Simone Weil, Gravity and Grace, and he calls it Grace and Gravity. And may I suggest that it seems to me that Albena was talking about the gravity and Andrew was talking about grace. And when I saw the angelic thing in there, I thought this is exactly what is required. And let me just elaborate a little bit, because I for a long time I've been studying Guattari, because I think he is clearly, very early understood that architecture cannot be reduced. We really need to retain irreducibility, that is, to ecology at all costs. So he would propose that, we have this, what he refers to as territories and flows. And it seems to me that Albena was making case for really paying attention to, how territories or bodies are built and what kind of forces engender this. But it seems to me that at the same time, in the same breath, Guattari would always say, but we cannot stay there. We need to have what he referred to as the universes of value or reference, which is to say the going beyond what is there. And then he even distinguished between what is, let's say, virtually possible and something that is actually possible. So almost what Andrew was describing in terms of possibilization. And his canonical example that I think brings it home is he says, long before we could fly, there was Leonardo da Vinci already thought about flying. And flying is according to him, would fall under this category of universes of value or universes of reference. But then the flow wasn't there. It was the jet machine that actually made it possible, the flow that engendered the blueprint, the new machinic phylum that then becomes, like organized. So we cannot ever give justice to, let's say, I immediately generalize architecture to, anything and everything that has to do with the design or technicity, so that we always have to take into account both the gravity and the grace. So that would be to say both the let's say the territory and the flows, but also the universes of value and the machinic phyla. And in these things, they continue to circulate. So it seems to me that that's how I read it, and I would be curious to hear from you, what you make of it. And maybe just a sub question, because I just came across, it was published this year, one of major Koolhaas's allies, Ranier de Graaf, has published this book, Architecture Against Architecture, it's a manifesto with 14 points where he, he asks for us to unionize the office, to make possible for trade unions to take, which is some controversial issues. So I was wondering if you also have some take on this. Thanks. It's both for both of you, whoever wishes to make a comment.
Andrew, you're the grace. You start.
Thank you. I haven't got a take on Ranieri. I haven't looked at that yet, so I'm hesitating, thinking that sounds more like Albena's kind of territory. But I don't know. Albena, do you want to take that up?
I'm not familiar either. Sorry.
No.
Maybe I can just very, very briefly, I have it in front of me. So basically he says we have to retire at 67. Then stop building, because we cease all new construction to break the cycle of environmental and social destruction. So reuse, abolish property, nationalize, and as I said, unionize the office, which is, from what I've heard, how AMO functions. That's a really interesting proposal coming from the horse's mouth. And tax the rich, and so on. It's pretty controversial.
They sound like valuable discussion points, but how they play out. I mean, I think architects tend to be very obedient and very easily coerced. I think they like to imagine themselves as radicals and posture as radicals, not least Rem Koolhaas, who is very much mediatized as a radical sort of architect, but actually he's very disciplined about following the money and doing things that the clients are interested in having done. And I think there's a really interesting dichotomy between what architects do and what their self-image is.
Yes. And if I'm allowed, just one very quick question, because at one point, Albena, you were suspicious about appropriating or misappropriating concepts from elsewhere. But at the same time, I've been thinking, it seems to me that from my own experience, people like Haraway, Karen Barad, and their concepts have been more influential in architecture than anything that comes from architecture, proper. So I'm wondering,
Absolutely.
not to mention Latour, and others.
Yeah, recently, yes, yeah, and of course all the generation of philosophers, including Guattari and that you mentioned, and Deleuze, yeah. I have my issue with this is that we very often take some of those concepts without, in a way, thinking about the transferability of the concept in our field, because these are concepts that have been coined on the basis of different empiric realities, on the basis of other studies, or either studies in the field of arts or sciences, or adjacent fields that might have some similarity with the field of architecture in terms of objects, in terms of processes, but there are also a lot of differences. And very often we take some of those concepts without reflecting on the nature of the concept we transfer, and without questioning the transferability. And this is the reason why some of those concepts become parasites in our field. They're just fancy concepts that very often lose the explanatory potential. They don't tell us anything. It's just a fancy concept that looks interesting in architectural discourse when we place it next to an architectural object or an architectural description or a building, and that's the kind of transfer that is problematic to me. If, of course, when a concept is taken and there's a clear understanding of what this concept has revealed, let's say in the field of the arts or in the field of sciences, and what's the explanatory potential of this concept to work in a successful way as an kind of almost like a tool, a kind of methodological tool that could unpack and reveal aspects of architectural objects and processes in our field, then and we can make it work. And very often we can see this in writings of colleagues of ours, when a concept is just taken artificially and imposed on architectural objects and phenomena, and when there's a real engagement and reflexivity, and this concept actually works and helps us to see things that we couldn't see before, to be on the safe side, I would say that the best for us in our field, in the field of architecture, is to rather take methodological insights from other fields and try to use them as methodological tactics that could help us look at architectural objects, processes, institutions, and phenomena in a new way. Yeah, and these methodological tactics very often could help us to coin our own terms. Yeah, to reveal empirics that we haven't seen before, and to unpack complexities that were not visible before. And once this is there, we don't need this other concept that comes from another field. We can invent our own concepts. And this is the kind of fruitful interference between fields that I was referring to, this kind of resonance between different fields, because very often there's similar developments happening in different fields. If we look at just one simple example, if we look at archives, because I studied this kind of archival turn that we have in the 90s with the arrival of the computer, there's so many, we cannot say that this just happened in the field of architecture, because at the same time in the 90s, humanities, there's so many parallel developments. For instance, in the field of arts, the emergence of archival arts. We have the writings of Derrida in philosophy, very much about the archival fever, which is not connected to the art. So one development, it's kind of many parallel developments, and they almost, we can almost see like resonance, different resonances, different reverberations between fields, but not a direct transfer of the concept of, let's say, archival fever from Derrida traveling to the field of the arts, then traveling to the field of architecture, because in architecture we have our own developments at the time related to the technology of the computer and many other archival, internal archival developments. So that's just one simple example, and of course we can think about many other examples that could illustrate this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Can I just throw in a comment here? I once had a conversation with Andrew Benjamin. Andrew Benjamin is a philosopher he used to be very present in the AA, and he's since moved to Australia. But I once commented to him, I kind of bemoaning the fact that architects were completely misunderstanding the work of Derrida and Deleuze in particular. And he said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They do something creative with it, you know. And there is this argument that Harold Bloom makes about the creative misunderstanding. And I think that that's how I describe architects. We misunderstand everything, but we're quite creative with our misunderstanding.
There is a question in the chat by Archnik. Yeah.
Yeah, Vasco. Do you want me to?
Can you read?
Okay, let me. Vasco is in Bangladesh, and it's often very noisy. Let me just go and okay. Let me just read it out. Is it possible that the crisis, in inverted commas, of architectural theory is actually a crisis of language? That our existing conceptual tools are no longer adequate to describe a reality shaped by digital simulation, AI, and global networks? Let me read that out again. Is it possible that the crisis, in inverted commas, of architectural theory is actually a crisis of language, that our existing conceptual tools are no longer adequate to describe a reality shaped by digital simulation, AI, and global networks? And that's Vasco is in Bangladesh, and of course Bangladesh is the one place where language led to a kind of revolution in some senses. But let me just throw that out there and invite both of you to comment on that.
Well, I'd say it's definitely got something to. It's part of the mix, but I think there's more to it than that. That there's all sorts of challenges to traditional authority roles, and well, even to the idea of learning and a university-based kind of education. I did a little teaching at the University of the Underground in Amsterdam, and what was interesting there is that you get people from very radically different backgrounds in what may be acting and chemistry and genetics and dance or something, being put together in order to see what happens. But a surprisingly substantial part of their course involved looking for sources of money to support this sort of activity, and to see where how the activity that they could engage, how to describe what they're doing in a way that makes it valued by corporate clients or whatever, things that disrupt the usual routine and make creative things happen. And I think architects need to think about those sorts of issues far, far more. I think the whole role of the traditional profession is in question. That as we face a future with also a proliferation of all sorts of different things going on, and the simulation of competence through AI and what have you, there's going to be different roles that people need to fulfill, and there will be ways to make an income from engaging with those things, but it's not at all evident instantly what they're going to be. It's going to involve some creative thought and lots of adaptability as we come to terms with a future that will probably continue to shift.
Albena?
I also think the question of language is crucial here, absolutely crucial. So how do we, to your specific example, how can we describe a reality shaped by digital simulation, AI, and global networks, which I think is an important question at the moment. So who do we listen to? Yeah, and as the previous question that we discussed with Andre, the question of transporting concept, but also conceptual language from different fields is not going to help us here, but we have to be attentive to the indigenous language of many different fields, in this particular case of technologies, of AI developers, of practices and businesses that are those that promote and employ those tools, but also, as we know, in progressive practices. At the moment, we have research think tanks that develop their own specific AI-driven tools that are very, in a way, respond to the needs of the practice. So all this kind of different engagement with AI and digital technologies will translate in different languages of different professionals, we might say, users communities and architectural communities, and we need to be able to capture all those languages, understand them and speak them in order to be able to theorize. So the question of crisis is definitely a question of a language, I would say, and that's an excellent point indeed. So again, I would say, instead of waiting for a philosopher to coin a term that will describe those AI-driven developments, we need to see what happens at the level of the practice and trace all these kind of transversal internal developments in all these professional communities. Dealing with AI, struggling, being exposed to the challenges of AI and digital simulation, and capture this language and concerns, because the concerns are articulated through language, both the cultural languages we have, but also technological languages. So unpacking the complexity of language that emerges in relationship to those concerns is something that we should definitely do as theorists, in order to be able to conceptualize from within the field of our practice these developments.
We have a question from or some comments, and a question from Gustavo. Gustavo, would you like to?
Oh, yes. I wanted to say thank you very much, Albena and Andrew, for the wonderful lectures today. My question goes as follows. In the art world and in the architecture world, Deleuze has been very current at some level to really just to demystify the static nature of architecture and look at the complex system nature, or I would say the dynamic nature of the field. In contemporary practice of teaching, how do we create I would say a scholar, researcher, and maker that can adapt to the understanding that we are in a complex, dynamical world? And then what type of curriculum is necessary? Would it start with critique? Would it start with the science, like Albena, the sciences behind how things are made, outside of the ego of the architect or the maker? How would you formulate that as a basis to make a more a student that could be flexible enough to change professions if needed?
Right. I mean, what I try to do is to uh, set myself on the same level as the student so that we're exploring together. So think of it as a research activity where I don't have all the answers and the student doesn't have all the answers, but we might have some ideas of how to explore. And so the exercise becomes, how do we find out about the things we need to find out about in order to make things happen, rather than saying, what is it that we're trying to impose here, or what am I trying to teach the student? It's much more a method of experiment and research rather than a transmission of knowledge. That's how I'd answer it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me as well, it's much more kind of taking those methods and the different tactics that I have talked about and turning them into pedagogical tactics of tracing, of close observation, of trying to understand the different actors and participants rather than assuming there's just one particular figure involved in design process, but also in dwelling and users' practices. So it's very much a pedagogical approach. My pedagogical approach is very much based on all these tactics that I presented, including architectural experiments, so experiments that students can conduct in order to find out how people behave in certain situations, to find out and identify problems in specific urban areas, to observe interactions and try to understand how these interactions in social space are connected to a particular architectural object and processes. And then after the observation, they could theorize. This observation in a way empowers them to theorize and to offer a very specific design intervention. To your first point, and I think this connects also to what Andre was saying in relationship to Deleuze and Guattari, of course, Deleuze and Guattari have been quite influential in our field, but we should not forget that they were quite inspired by architecture themselves, yeah, especially Guattari, as you might have researched this, Andre, because Guattari was very much inspired by Japanese architecture, and he, in the 80s, he went to Japan and he met the famous Japanese postmodernist Shin Takamatsu. And he was very much inspired by the machinic type of architecture of Takamatsu. And all these concepts of fasciality, machinic, they come from an inspiration that is genuinely an inspiration that comes from architecture, fascination with the machinic architecture of Takamatsu. So this kind of encounter between architecture and philosophy was quite productive, quite inspirational for Deleuze and Guattari, and this inspired back concepts in the field of philosophy. So for me, it's not surprising that these concepts are relevant to us because they are genuinely inspired by this dialogue with architecture. So this is just a simple example for us to also look for ways to influencing other fields, not just to transport concepts and inspirations, but architectural processes and ways of thinking can also inspire other fields and other professionals to think differently. And there's a lot that we can offer in adjacent fields, from geography to anthropology, material culture studies, and of course, philosophy, arts, and science. So we have to also think about our impact and the theory of the impact of our concepts and how they could travel outside the field.
Just one follow-up for Andrew and Albena. I think one thing that I've really appreciated from the profession of architecture is working with scientists, researchers, mathematicians. We have kind of a spatial and design and kind of domain. That's our domain. We see things. and we can map things in real time, faster than the computer, probably, let's say. But at some level, the education isn't universal. You can go to one architectural school and they don't have an understanding of critique. And I think that's kind of where I think, how do you, as I would say, Andrzej and Dolmenina, Neil, all of you, you guys are kind of leaders in the field. How do you create like a manifesto where everyone can have at least a basic vocabulary of not only theory and practice, but critique, philosophy, and the larger view of, I would say, complexity science. Like architects are part of this. We're these designers in the loop. At some level, scientists need engineers like architects to design a better world. So how do you see the role of theory and critique now with the larger problems that are coming ahead? I don't think we can outthink climate change. It's not going to make us warmer or colder. So how can we push these scientists and engineers and politicians forward with our domain knowledge?
Mm. Yeah, well, that's a very big question.
Yes.
Right. I don't think we can revert climate change, but we can instigate small changes at the level of education. And that's a fantastic question indeed. How do we make it accessible for everyone? So platforms like Digital Future, I mean, you're already that's an important mediator. And I spoke about the mediators, the importance of those mediators. We as educators, we're part of this network of mediators and many different platforms that, for instance, I'm thinking about the book series of Routledge, philosophers, thinkers for architects, and Andrew is the author of Deleuze for architects. I have written Latour for architects, which is all open sources. So all these books are available open sources. So that's one possible way to kind of mediate knowledge through the publications, through discussion platforms, through accessible forms of pedagogy that do not require prior knowledge, but in a way offer a number of methodological tactics, simple tactics for acquiring knowledge, for students to be able to gain knowledge through observation. And we can continue the list. So there are many ways of being creative in terms of the platforms and the types of mediations that we as educators and thinkers can adapt to this need to make education accessible in spite of the rigidity of institutions, both educational and publishing institutions. That's that's my answer to the first point. And as far as the change we can instigate on the political or ecological level, again, my answer is that we have to inspire architects, students architects to engage in small changes, and we have to convince them that big change, big revolutionary change only happens as a result of the accumulation, of the gradual accumulation of small changes that we are able to, in a way, instigate and cultivate together through education, through patient and informed research. So that's my very modest suggestion here, making them believe that we can all kind of trigger big revolutionary changes. It's not realistic, and I don't think it's a kind of realistic pedagogical task for us as well.
The thing I can add to that is just to notice that architects are already pretty good at talking to different groups of people. They're expected to mediate between maybe a client who might be literate in management speak and finances and so on, and then translate things into a design, and then talk to people working on the building site who have a completely different range of cultures and vocabularies. And the architect is the go-between between all those different sorts of people. If you want to extend that range into scientists and philosophers and so on, that's entirely possible. But it takes time. It takes familiarity with the people in those other disciplines in order to develop a relaxed and informative way of communicating with them. But architects probably have some notion of science from their school days. They probably have some notion of creative arts from their school days, and all sorts of experience within the architecture schools. And architects are generalists. They don't have well, they do have some core expertise, but it does involve moving between all sorts of things that other people know lots more about. It's important for architects not to be taken over by those other things, so that if you're talking with philosophers, you want to come away with some familiarity of philosophical discipline and some concepts perhaps from the philosophers, but the problems that the architect faces are architecture problems. And if he goes away having learned what the philosophers' problems are and tries to address those, he's going to lose. It's not well grounded in that sort of thing. And so what we need to think of is multidisciplinary teams, and what are the groups of skills that we need in order to address a problem, and then bring people in with those different skills. And the architect, I think, is often a good mediator between the different groups. Maybe not the person with the specialist skill, but a good communicator to move between different things. I really think that's a valuable skill that architects have that isn't developed and certainly not monetized in the way that it could be in the future.
Maybe I could just throw in one comment quickly. The question of knowledge has come up quite extensively today. And this, as we move forward into the age of AI, is going to be a real challenge. I'm just working on a book on AI and education with two colleagues at the moment, and it's obvious that's going to be the case. So first of all, I would want to comment that basically in terms of knowledge, we already had a session on digital futures with Sanjay Sama from MIT, the open learning platform there, and he made the comment that actually there is more information already on YouTube than any professor already knows. So that immediately shifts us into a situation whereby the professor is not so much the purveyor of knowledge, so much as a kind of, let's say, a curiosity stimulator, and kind of, as Andrew was saying, kind of working with the students, trying to open up avenues of inquiry. But the point that's made about AI is that, very soon knowledge is going to be completely free, and it's going to be so available. And the real problem for architects is that we have, for many professions actually, that we've defined ourselves as being the sole purveyors of knowledge about a certain sort of discipline. So when that all opens up, that leads to a kind of crisis in terms of the future. So I think the question about knowledge is going to be central to how we operate as educators in the future.
Yeah, when you say knowledge, it's very interesting. Is it knowledge as information, as factual knowledge? Because that's what AI captures. But it's not knowledge as tactile knowledge, or knowledge as experimental knowledge, or the kind of knowledge that we acquire in studio, or the kind of knowledge that the reflective practitioner Donald Sean famous kind of study of studio teaching and that kind of pedagogy. So that's a different type of knowledge, and I don't think that AI will ever replace the kind of tactile experimental knowledge that students will acquire in studio that makes them reflective practitioners, precisely because of the specificity of design knowledge, which is not just factual knowledge, information compared to the sciences, for instance, chemistry or biology. So I think we need perhaps to make some distinctions in terms of the typology of knowledge that AI will affect and how it will affect them differently.
I mean, yes, but okay. So the big debate right now in the world of AI is about spatial intelligence. In other words, many people are saying, Fei Li in particular, that you're never going to reach AGI, artificial general intelligence, the point where AI matches human intelligence, unless you have some kind of a spatial intelligence. And I think this is the thing that typically AI-controlled robots they're not so very good at catching balls, that kind of thing, that kind of the physical world. Having said that, there are those who say, and so in other words, an LLM, the kind of like the large language model behind the ChatGPT and so on, is never going to be able to capture that. Having said that, there are those that disagree. Blaise Aguirre-Arcos being one particular individual who thinks that it's already embedded in that sort of in the context and so on is already embedded in these LLMs. So it's a kind of contested point, I would say. Yes, it most likely is. Well, let's see. But I think this is going to be one of the big challenges in the future. Harith has got a question. Harith is Al Saidi, who is in Baghdad, and yesterday. Is he's still with us? He put the question in the chat. Let me read this out, because yesterday he was with us, but the question it was gone by the time the question was asked. Okay. Okay. This is the question. In an era where the architectural text, in inverted commas, is being rewritten by algorithmic languages, how do we reevaluate the legitimacy of metaphor, inverted commas, borrowed from literary criticism? If the traditional tools of deconstruction were designed for the written word, are they still sufficient to critique visual variables generated by high-dimensional data and neural weights? Do I need to read that again, maybe? In an era where the architectural model, quotes, is being rewritten by algorithmic languages, how do we reevaluate the legitimacy of the metaphor borrowed from literary criticism? If the traditional tools of deconstruction were designed for the written word, are they still sufficient to critique visual variables generated by high-dimensional data and neural weights? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to say that's not my problem. It's I don't know that I would think about things in that way at all.
Albena?
If we take this at the level of the practice, again, in terms of the level of the practice, what AI will do at the level of the practice, I think that we will still need the written word, just as we will need the input of the architect at the end of hundreds possible options generated by Midjourney or DALL-E 3. We still need the decision making of a human, the adjustments, the kind of the material constraints to be double checked, the planning regulations to be accurate, all this kind of the weight of material constraints and regulation, the adjustments, the need for adjusting the visual output generated by AI. will also prompt the need to go back to traditional textual expression. And I think we will not be able, in terms of the practice, it will not be able to just rely on visual variables without referring to analog or kind of more traditional ways of expressing grounding and checking the feasibility of design, and perhaps using a metaphor that comes from the use of Mid-Journey. But I do, of course, this will prompt the invention of a new language, but this will take some time. I think at this stage, when maybe only 40% of architectural practices are familiar or have used some kind of AI tools, it's kind of early age for us to predict how these major technological developments will also affect reflection, language, and critique. And these developments, at least for the next 10 years, I think will go in parallel with the traditional writing and tools and the tools of critique.
Can I ask, Dulmini has a question.
So
Dulmini,
thank
would
you
you
so
like to?
much, Albena and Andrew. And I think part of my question, I think Gustavo kind of posed part of it. But I think the both of you, when you were speaking, and Andrew with the sort of the angel of history and movement and time, and then Albena talking about the sort of minor revolution, the major revolution. I mean, in all those questions, there was this sort of idea about change and how we think about change and how theory can help us address change, right? And I think Andrew also mentioned the fact that then the issue that we have right now is not change, but change of change, so acceleration in a way. So this question about sort of time being out of joint, and the fact that the moment we try to understand something, that things already sort of, in a different state, and having to deal with that condition, being like, a part of what we have to do as theorists. And what would be your sort of reflections on that, or how would you suggest that we go about thinking that condition, perhaps, or working with it?
I think at a practical level, the thing you have to do is to stay awake and keep thinking. There tends to be a model of education which suggests that you're based in a school for a certain number of years and you learn the things you're going to need for your time in practice, for your career. That's gone. And so if we're not learning all the time and exploring and finding out new things, then we'll be left behind and things will die around us. So I do think there's a role for traditional knowledge and traditional practices, but we also have to be awake to the need for new traditions that learn from what's going on around us in ways that help us to face the future. And so there has to be a developing, learning, revisiting, thinking going on all the time. And so if you like, the things that are based on knowledge, perhaps we can find from our search engines. The things that are based on thinking, they still depend on us putting two and two together, making some sort of analysis of what's happening. But we do need to stay awake and carry on learning things and not being complacent. So I think the research mentality that some people have and other people don't have, and that you can develop and can ingrain, I think that's going to be vital for facing the future. I think everyone's going to have it if they're going to flourish as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a very important question indeed, especially in the light of challenges that have been mentioned, like climate change, the geopolitical instabilities that many parts of the world are facing at the moment, wars and inequality. So to what extent architects can instigate change, and how our critique could, in a way, be attuned with the capability of architects to generate change? I think that's a very important question. And for me, the answer is not to approach change in a militant way, in a kind of blatantly political militant way, because we have a lot of kind of recent revival in activism with capital A, which is usually like a militant attitude. Let's go against climate change. So this kind of attitude has proven to be unsuccessful in the past. And that's, of course, a big statement, and we do not have the time to to discuss it all. But what I think we are capable of doing today is to trigger change from within. So, for instance, climate change or any aspects of our design that could consider climatic aspects, use and recycling has been mentioned, the different life of materials, the afterlife of objects when we stage an exhibition, or the multi-species relationships that our design might affect. So small changes at the level of the design can be done that could have bigger effects in the future. So cultivating this sensitivity in our pedagogy is extremely important, because this empowers us as educators, but also our students, to instigate change from within. So that there could be different technologies that could be used, that there could be different ways of considering social vulnerability of communities or climatic instability that our design could address in smaller ways, with small tactics. But this, because it's done from within, could trigger bigger effects in the future. So for me, that's the answer, to try to adapt and in a way inspire changes from within, rather than prepare for a militant, in a way, activist position, which is much more confrontational and requires us to mobilize politics with capital P. And the role of architects, of course, would change in a configuration where we have to also be militant and actively engaged politically. So we have the power, a much bigger power, I would say, to transform the world from within without confronting other communities and people with different beliefs.
Albena, I just wanted to share just a very quick question. Why, if science is such a very successful endeavor for humanity, why hasn't the architectural profession moved in that direction more? Why aren't we sharing more knowledge? Is it just purely capitalism that is, and competition, that's stopping us from coming together? Because I wondered that all these books and all these scientists, they have this that I've met in my last 10 years. They're so they have an aura about them that they're making this contribution to world knowledge and progress. But with architecture, I don't see it that way. I feel the competition. I feel there's a desperation to it as well, the relevance. So, could you foresee the profession moving toward that scientific model where we share resources and we build on knowledge, and that we help our profession and ourselves evolve?
Yeah, that's a great proposal, but you had also at the end of the question. Well, I have seen in the recent Biennale, which I mentioned shortly, an attempt to do this. There were a number of projects where scientists and architects were invited to collaborate together around a particular issue. Let's say water purification. That's a case study that I focused connected to the installation of Liz Diller's office in New York, and this Canal Cafe installation, which you might have seen when visiting the Biennale, which takes water from the canal and purifies it, and it's a kind of laboratory setting that literally shows to the visitors at the Biennale how water is gradually turning, kind of getting clearer and clearer, and turns into a potable water that could be used for a small espresso at the end of this installation. So it's like a huge scientific, kind of quasi-scientific performance. But behind this, there was a real collaboration between architects working alongside water scientists and water engineers specializing in water purification. That's not the kind of collaboration we usually have with engineers, right? We usually collaborate with mechanical engineers or structural engineers. So that was quite an interesting experiment, precisely aiming to achieve what you said, this kind of collaboration, sharing of resources, sharing of data, and coming together around a particular issue, kind of joining forces to resolve a particular issue, which is the depletion of water resources. So some of these experiments, so I mentioned one experiment that was successful, but some of these experiments were successful, other experiments were not successful, precisely because architects refused to work with scientists or to work on a particular issue which was not the problem they were interested in. And in a Biennale, as you know, everyone would prefer to bring a project that was already successful to display knowledge that is already generated somewhere else in a university or in an architectural studio, rather than engage in an experiment of crafting new knowledge in collaboration with others. So that was an interesting experiment for me to observe, and perhaps there's an answer there for you, that maybe there's some kind of resistance, although we are collaborating with different professionals, as Andrew was saying, although the architect is very often the mediator in this kind of interdisciplinary constellations of professional collaborations. We are perhaps not prepared enough to exchange and share knowledge with professionals around a particular issue, around a particular concern, and maybe more experiments around this have to be made in the future. We have to perhaps, in a way, inspire and kind of stimulate thinking around these collaborations that can actually result in problem solving, in addressing specific issues of concern to specific communities, where architects could bring knowledge that is complementary to engineers, that is complementary to nanoscientists or ornithologists. And by bringing all these different sets of knowledge together around a specific problem, you can actually make change from within, as we were discussing. And that's a different constellation of practice, where you as an architect, you should not be working just with your group of collaborators in the office, but you have to go out of your zone of comfort and being exposed to different type of knowledge, different also methods and different collaborative practices, as you were saying, because scientists do collaborate in a different way than we do in our field.
But it's also worth saying that there's different sorts of architects, and the kind of architects who collaborate on projects like the Biennale coffee machine. That's extending the idea of what architecture is beyond the usual sort of thing, and there's definitely scope for architects to collaborate, to pool knowledge, but it would be in addressing some sorts of questions. And I get the impression that a lot of the shared culture of architects is much more about exciting one another by finding new ways to be cool. You know, the kind of things that get illustrated in the zine newsletters and so on. Those are the things that the architects are really wanting to do and really excited about. And that's not going to benefit from the careful shared processes of developing knowledge. That's much more about individual showing off. And so you need a different image of what an architect is in order to have a mentality where that kind of collaboration and co-participation becomes valued and esteemed and rewarded in the profession.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to thank you both. This has been such a stimulating discussion, and I want to thank Neil and Andrzej and Domini and all of the Digital Futures team. Thank you very much.
Can I just throw something out there just before we wrap up? I mean, because there's always this question of what a new tool affords. I mean, you can't predict that. I think with the mobile phone, for example, they initially thought it was going to be for rich businessmen, and then all of a sudden, different forms of social use opened up, and it kind of went beyond any form of prediction. And I think what is interesting for me in the context of AI is to think about what maybe new skill sets might begin to emerge from engaging with this technology. And in a sense, we might lose some things, but at the same time, we might indeed start developing new skill sets. Douglas Rushkoff, in his book Children of Chaos, talks about this, about how we maybe can't spell and can't add up so well as we used to in the past, but that doesn't matter because we've got spell check and we've got calculators and so on. But he said it's important to recognize what new skills are coming through. And this was like 30 years ago now, and he comments on multitasking as being one of those aspects of that. And I guess I'm interested right now, and personally, I'm kind of exploring myself, what that might be in the context of AI, especially in the context of theory, of thinking, and so on. There is a perennial concern that actually AI might reduce our capacity to think critically. That's a big debate going on, and there's been some research that was published by I think MIT Media Lab, which was showing that actually the real problem potentially with using some of these models, these tools, these chatbots and so on, is that you just switch off. And they would kind of like monitoring brain activity of those using ChatGPT and discovered that actually the brain pretty much shuts off. Now, that may well be the case, but I would want to hold out the hope that actually something else completely different might also emerge. And that is to say, a creative engagement with the technology that might lead to a deeper level of critical debate that comes out of engaging with AI. And so there's also a study that's shown that and this was by Harvard, the same side of the Charles River, but different university, that was saying that actually you could improve the quality of the output by 40%, and so on. A lot of other advantages. I personally think that actually there might be something that coming out of the interaction between ourselves and that other model, a form of co-intelligence, but pushing it beyond what's been said so far about Ethan Molliker's have got a book on co-intelligence, talking about maybe the interactions that might be possible. And I see increasingly the potential of seeing AI as a form of interlocutor. In other words, something to debate with that's out there. And I certainly find it useful if I've written something. I've run out of friends I've lost all my friends because I keep asking to read what I've written and to give me feedback. But AI can do it incredibly quickly, 2 seconds, and very powerful feedback. And that sort of interaction, I think potentially could lead to a higher level of critical debate, a higher level of thinking, So that's my hope. That's my hope. Whether that happens or not is another case. But I think we're seeing history in the making. We're seeing a tool that we're appropriating and adopting and really seeing the affordances, to use an expression from J.J. Gibson that Andre is so familiar with, seeing the affordances of this new tool. So let me just throw that thought out there, that in an optimistic way, that maybe we might see some high-level critical debate. But there we go. So we should wrap things up. I always like to keep these things within 2.5 hours because we go on forever if we. But it's a bit daunting to anyone to go and to watch an entire video that long. So let's wrap things up. But just to say, just thanks so much to Andrew and Albena for their contributions. Really, this series is proving to generate a lot of interesting discussion. And let me just simply say, since yesterday's session, which we held, we have had a discussion among ourselves. That is the team that's been putting to get this together, including Andre and Dulmini, who are here today. To actually will go forward and make this into a book, because I think it's such an important kind of set of questions about, thinking through what is the role, what the role when there is a crisis, and whether that could be perhaps a good thing in architectural theory. And certainly we're gathering up a lot of interesting viewpoints. We're hoping Peter Eisman's had said that he was happy to contribute to us. We're hoping to fix him up as well, include him. And we'll be going on till next year. So anyway, I'd like to also thank the Digital Futures team, Smaro, who is being very quiet at the back here, but who's actually doing a PhD on AI herself, who's been live streaming it. The team that Maria from Brazil, who put the poster together. This is a totally global community, which is so beautiful. That we have Harith from Iraq and Vasco from Bangladesh asking questions, and everyone else from around the world. So anyway, thank you for your contributions, everyone. We have some more sessions coming up, but thank you for today. And I think hopefully it'll be just not the end of it, but the beginning of things, if we can get you all to contribute, Andrew and Albena, to this book itself. So thank you. It's been an incredible, revelation, all these discussions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neil. Thank you.